If you were to ask someone who grew up back in the early 1960s about the scariest times they ever experienced, a common answer would be the week-long standoff in October of 1962. Three leaders of three nations would face off in a struggle to keep peace between each other, or face nuclear devastation. Everybody knows the story of what happened in Cuba, but what about what happened back on the home front?
This is a special report from CBS News.
Not content.
Good evening, this is Walter Cronkite, CBS News headquarters in New York.
In Cuba, 7th day. Now, here is NBC News White House correspondent.
United States has not content Stevenson terms with Dr.
This is the week, these 7 days that shook the world, the United States almost went to nuclear war.
As the Cuban regime waited to see what their bosses in the Kremlin were to do to able-bodied men through military training. He has even armed some as young as 12 years of age, and authorities assembled thousands in cities and villages for patriotic rallies. As in the past, these rallies are designed to whip up the heat of what Castro called Yankee warmongers. Suggestions that a UN team inspect missile sites.
Suddenly the idea of civil defense no longer seems either useless or foolish.
With your thing that further action, and we're going to find ourselves getting out of control. Okay.
On October 22nd, 1962, things in the public world were the same as they'd been for the past few months. Halloween was right around the corner. Kids and teens were listening to a hit by a band called the Beach Boys. It was called Surfin' Safari. And many Americans were learning about a country named Uganda that had just won its independence on the 9th. And as far as many people thought, the Russians had been behaving normally. The government was really busy on the current elections, and the majority of citizens couldn't care less about civil defense. But they would have been if they knew what was actually going on. See, we had just found out that the Reds were giving Castro nuclear missiles, and they could hit most of the eastern U.S. We had photographic evidence of this caught by our U-2 spy planes over Cuba. And we were trying to negotiate or get a way to get those missiles out of there. There were talks of airstrikes, invasions, and worse. No decision had been reached though, but more missiles were being placed in Cuba. The situation had escalated to a point that Kennedy wanted to address the nation about what was actually happening. At 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Kennedy delivered this message.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Upon receiving the first preliminary hard information of this nature, last Tuesday morning at 9 a.m., I directed that our surveillance be stepped up. And having now confirmed and completed our evaluation of the evidence and our decision on a course of action, this government feels obliged to report this new crisis to you in fullest detail.
And he did. He explained it perfectly. But only for time constraints, I'm not going to show all of it, sorry. Following this unsettling new information, citizens, politicians, and our old friends from the CD started thinking of the worst. Our most southern state, Florida, was in a tactically bad area for a scenario like this. We knew at the time that these missiles in Cuba could reach Washington, D.C., that's about 1,200 miles away from Cuba, in about 13 minutes. How quick would it be then for a city like Miami that's a little over 100 miles away from Cuba? They would have at most 2 minutes warning before a nuclear impact. Many people, not just the civil defense and the government, realized the severity of this situation. You could see panic set in almost immediately. The following footage proves this. Most were panicking like this the following morning. Everyone had their own reaction. A lot of people were doing what you're seeing on screen right now. Panic shopping. Raiding stores for vital necessities and leaving store shelves blank and empty. But like in any time of panic, there's always the skeptics and the Pollyannas who won't prepare for what's to come, as you can see here.
How much does this order cost you?
I spent $18.90.
Is this your normal order, or are you stockpiling?
Oh, I'm not stockpiling. I feel that if anything were to happen, you wouldn't be able to eat it anyhow.
You, ma'am, how much did your order cost you?
Oh, my order came to $19.70. It's my regular weekly order.
You're not stockpiling, then?
No, I'm not, but I noticed that most of the Cuban families are really loading up. I don't know what they're afraid of if we aren't. But I noticed one order came to about $45.
Civil defense was somewhat of a controversial topic before this happened. But for this short time, most people were for the CD. Many also thought that this could have been the start of an apocalypse, so many people joined in the CD effort. Most of what we know was done was preparing more fallout shelters and doing last-minute checks on Conrad and races, and doing last-minute training on Oxfire and Ox Police units. Most already knew that any type of nuclear warfare would end with a massive tragedy. There would be no real winner. There were also many people who thought that we should go to war with Russia and Cuba. Some were also calling Cuba's bluff, which was actually in turn right. President Kennedy raised the civil defense funding and budgets through the roof. Same for the manufacturers of civil defense equipment and rationing. There were some towns who took the news so bad that they basically shut down, staying inside their homes all week. Schools were canceled for days as the world waited for Armageddon. Newsreels would make daily films about the incident in Cuba.
The United States answer to what Adlai Stevenson termed Soviet blackmail in Cuba was a quarantine of all offensive weapons being shipped from Russia to that island fortress. The U.S. threw up a steel fence prepared to stop any vessel carrying materials of war. In Cuba itself, 100,000 men were put under emergency orders as they had been during past invasion scares. The waterfront in Havana and along other parts of the coast bristled with gun emplacements as the Cuban regime waited to see what their bosses in the Kremlin were to do.
As the days followed, things were getting more out of hand, not just for Kennedy and XCOM, but for the American people and the civil defense. The CD was bombarded with calls asking for information or for fallout shelter materials. In some areas, there was recorded false alarms of nuclear attack that were actually taking place. But at last, on the 28th, Kennedy, Castro, and Khrushchev reached an agreement, and the missiles were brought out of Cuba. At long last, this 1 week of hysteria has came to an end. But throughout this time, civil defense remained on top of everything. They stayed true to their protocols and setups. They had enough common sense not to deal with rumors and false alarms. The CD's confidence led Americans through this time of panic. Most of all, they knew, possibly even more so than XCOM could know, the sheer brutality of a nuclear war. Sure, they would have been able to keep America around after the nuclear exchange, without a doubt. Hell, they taught us enough for 2 decades about what to do. And in saying that, I propose this question. What would have it been like if civil defense wasn't there?
When you see this sign, it's time to go. This sign, you'll know it's time to go when the siren starts to blow. Remember the civil defense sign.